Welcome back, everyone, to another Bleak Rides. True crimes, murder, mystery, and motorcycles. I've got a good story for you today. Want to thank all of you for coming along. Let's get into it, shall we? Today's story picks up in 1925, a time when liquor was illegal. The country was dealing with Prohibition. Religious groups dotted the landscape. The Christian unions were strong at this time. And that's what our story centers on. The life and times of Myrtle Cook, women's leader, voice in the Christian Union, outspoken about the devil's booze. This cold case has become one of the most studied cold cases ever to have occurred in Iowa. To this day, investigators and internet sleuths still look into the crime with prying eyes and fresh ideas, hoping to unravel some deeper end of it all. Right before her death, Myrtle was practicing for a speech she would give later that evening at the Christian Union's women's group. Was it the speech that got her killed? She was doing it with the window open. Someone walking by overheard something they didn't like as she talked about the perils facing this country and women in regards to the devil's drink. Myrtle lived at 703 3rd Avenue in Vinton, Iowa, a part of Benton County. For the time, she was an incredibly strong and courageous, outspoken woman. She was also the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Myrtle Cook wasn't the kind of president or woman to rest on her laurels. She was very active in her community and had recently published the names of people she suspected in Benton County of bootlegging. Bootlegging at this time was a punishable crime. People would face legal problems or jail time. And it was bad for business too. But nevertheless, she had published a list of people she suspected of being involved in this illicit trade. And along with her publishing of the list of names, she would also speak out. Again, this was a time known as Prohibition, and she was not at all a statesman. One newspaper after her death said she had caused many people to, quote, emphatically detest her. Her house had been egged on many occasions. She believed the young kids of the neighborhood had been hired by bootleggers to intimidate her. And it did not go unnoticed. She made the statement to a friend that this kind of work may someday get her killed. Myrtle's mother-in-law was upstairs in the house that night. She had been listening to her reciter speech over the noise of a thunderstorm and the rumbling of the railroad tracks nearby. Her mother-in-law heard what she thought was more of the thunder from the storm, and then silence. She headed down to check on Myrtle, where she saw her on the floor, gasping and bleeding. Blood poured out her chest. The bullet had entered the house through a window. It had entered her heart, and she would be dead within an hour. Myrtle Cook died September 7th, 1925, at night in her home in Vinton. And now we'll get into some of the theory, the ongoing scrutiny, and why this cold case has left a bad taste in so many people's mouths. Why it's still looked at to this day, hoping to find some deeper meaning. This was pre the civil rights movement. This was a very hard time in our nation's history. A very bad time, a very bloody time. This woman was more, you see, than just the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was a member of the KKK. If you're not familiar with this particular group, they're a group of individuals who hate and terrorize Americans for their skin color. Also, incredibly religious radicals. When Cook's casket made it to the cemetery, there waiting in ceremonial fashion was a cross set ablaze to honor their fallen member. The hateful pastor officiating it had titled his speech, "Did She Die in Vain? A Rally Cry for Fellow Haters." The story of a woman murdered, shot down in her own house, who had been fighting bootleggers, and whose funeral was attended by a very visible Ku Klux Klan contingent, made news all over the United States. Cook's story is still considered a noteworthy part of the era, of the history, and has been mentioned in many books and college courses. The rest of what I'm going to fill in here is a little bit of fact mixed with the theoretical. I'll do my best to differentiate the two, but here we go. The identity of the person who murdered her remains a mystery. Although famously said by Judge John W. Tobin in 1986, he believed he knew who pulled the trigger. Others weren't so sure. Some have pointed fingers at Cook's estranged husband, Clifford, who was living in Sioux City at the time of her murder, and who had begun a relationship with another woman before his wife's murder. Very unreligious. Myrtle Cook's last speech was found there at her desk by the window, and reads as follows. To say America cannot enforce prohibition is to do violence to America's traditions, and to us underestimate the American spirit, the American willpower. It has turned apparent impossibilities into wondrous achievements. We need women who are unafraid, just as our mothers, women who believe in God and home and country, who stand for purity and truth, as strong, united sisters, and will reinstate the old-fashioned religion in our schools and over our land. Friends, are we afraid to take up this burden? But it is hard for someone to keep on the firing line all the time. Others put their shoulders to the wheel. Let us pray that every Christian woman will enlist. That's an end quote. And the end of what sounded like a pretty racist rant. Cook's belief on prohibition was not liked by everyone. Women were not afforded the same protections they are in our modern day. There was a lot of growing to do as a nation. And there were a lot of people who wanted to buy and sell alcohol, who did not like the things she had to say, and were willing to go the extra mile to ensure they never happened. You know, the mafia was active in the United States at this time. Could they have had a hand in the murder? The Cedar Valley Daily Times would say after her death in an article that she was generally regarded as being meddlesome. Still, said the Times editor, people are not murdered because they are disliked. But perhaps the racism or the alcohol prohibition put a target on her that no one could stop. This murder served as a wake-up call to the residents of Vinton, Iowa. Men and women who were formerly pretty indifferent have been awakened to the menace of the booze ring and racist hate groups in their area. being a national spectacle. Dozens of reporters from across the nation had flocked to Vinton and were quoting everyone who would talk to them. What they falsely depicted as the town being a friendly harbor to criminals and a welcoming rendezvous point for bootleggers and evildoers was later disproven, as the residents of Vinton did not see things that way, although Myrtle Cook did. Cook's estranged husband, later viewed as a suspect, although he claimed to have been stranded by a rainstorm in Grundy Center. It made roads too muddy for his driving, and he also gave authorities some conflicting and false information about his relationship with a woman named Hester Sealing, whom he later married. But a salesman who had been to Grundy Center told authorities that he had seen Clifford at a hotel on the night of the murder, verifying Clifford Cook's story. To the conclusion of Clifford Cook, he had been unfairly accused of his wife's murder, but fairly accused of indiscretions. A more likely suspect, wrote the judge presiding, was a young man named Harold Ponder. Ponder's acquaintance described him as a lame brain, a dingbat, a blabbermouth. He had been in trouble with the law on many occasions. He'd even escaped from state penitentiary the week before this woman was murdered. After being arrested for stealing a car, he disappeared from authorities, and they began to consider him as a possible suspect for things in that area. As he was never heard from again, we'll never know. Sometime later, it became popular to believe that after doing this job, he had been disposed of by the person who hired him, and to avoid any possibility of him being the blabbermouth he was known to be. Ironically, former Benton County Sheriff Kenneth Popenhagen, who was at work in the office when 4 unsolved murders took place between 1977 and 1981, said the same thing happened to the prime suspects in those cases. They died before they could face prosecution. Nobody knows for sure. Was it a mafia connection? Was this a assassination hit? Did it come from one of the people who opposed her position on Prohibition? Did it come from someone ridding the world of racism, one evil lady at a time? It will forever be speculated. This was so long ago, the details are lost. The witnesses are long gone, and there was no such thing as forensic evidence back then. Her death did have purpose. It, like I said, worked as a wake-up call to the residents of Vinton, who realized they wanted nothing to do with these white robe-wearing people. They wanted nothing to do with the gang-like dangers associated with the bootleggers and the rum runners. They were a bad group. And the people of Vinton were just a bit more law-abiding. They went to work. They came home. They mowed their yards. They weren't about all this riffraff, all this hate, or all this boozing. The life and times of Myrtle Cook are as follows. Myrtle Underwood Cook was born June 1874 to an ensign and Martha Beatty Baker. Her son was born March 7th, 1911. He died 6 days later on March 13th. They later adopted a daughter, Gertrude, who passed away June 24th of 2000. Myrtle was buried at the Evergreen Ceremony in Benton, near her infant son. If you have any information about Myrtle's unsolved murder case, please contact the Vinton Police Department, and I'll list the number in the description below. And that's it. That's the story of Myrtle Cook. What do y'all think? Did she deserve it? Did she not deserve it? Does anyone deserve it? Do you think it was the Klan? Do you think it was the Mafia? Was it the bootleggers? Was it the townspeople of Vinton? We could throw around theory all day. No one will ever really know. But this has been an interesting story and a ride. I want to thank you all for coming along. If you haven't already, please take a chance to like the video. If you've stayed around this long, you probably did. And consider subscribing. This is what I do here on the channel. Or when possible, I shoot other motorcycle content. And I'll get back to that. You can show your support for Bleak Rides. I have a Patreon. For $1 a month, it'll help the channel grow. I have a Discord where we talk about true crimes, do case studies, and occasionally conversate about motorcycles too. If you haven't noticed, there's a theme on my channel, motorcycles and murder. That's what we do here, and I want to thank you again for coming along.